Well, Comrade Chairman, comrades, it's a bit unusual for you to see me sitting down. That's because I've got a football injury. Not from playing football in the last couple of days, but an historic football injury, if you like. But I hope it won't distract from the important issues that we're going to discuss here this afternoon. Because this issue is not about one man. No matter how brilliant he was in his life and in his analysis. What we're discussing here is really Marxism in the modern era. And that means the method, the program, and the organization to arm the working class for the battles that impend. At the beginning of this century, and we don't know how long that battle will go on. Now, in 1938, Trotsky made a famous statement where he said, the Fourth International, which was the international organization that he'd organized with his collaborators, the Fourth International will be the major force on the planet in 10 years. Now, unfortunately, some people took that literally. In my opinion, I haven't got time to mention this now, but Trotsky's prognosis of the situation that developed in the aftermath of the Second World War was spot on, where he predicted a revolutionary wave. That began in Italy in 1943, 1944, with the uprising of the Italian working class in northern Italy. It was carried on in Greece. It developed in the movements in France. And of course, it was partially reflected in the election of the first majority Labour government in Britain. Now, unfortunately, those people who literally interpreted the words of Trotsky made a fundamental error. Actually, it led to a number of mistakes they made, where they said in 1947, well, within 9 years after Trotsky made his famous statement, but there's only a year to go, so we'll be the major force on the planet in a year's time. What they hadn't taken account of was that social democracy and Stalinism came to the assistance of capitalism and saved it at that particular conjuncture. To understand perspectives for the working class and Trotskyism, we must have an all-rounded analysis. And we must try and work out the perspectives for capitalism, above all in the next period and beyond. There are going to be great opportunities for the working people to take power. Not just abroad, but it will be posed in Britain in your lifetime, if not in my lifetime. And therefore, we have to look at the present situation, which is a kind of interregnum in the development of events worldwide. And let's look at the world today, and let us try and anticipate the reaction of the working class to the developments that are likely to take place. Now, the first point to make is that semi-consciously, the ideologists of the ruling class, the thinkers of the ruling class, paint a gloomy picture of the reality, of the so-called reality at the present time. For instance, you will see many headlines and many articles about the situation in the Middle East. And yes, it is gloomy. But nevertheless, this is an attempt to actually demoralize or semi-demoralize the youth, the advanced layers of the working class, and it's only one side of the picture. Because the Middle East, let us remind ourselves, experienced the Arab Spring, the revolution in the Middle East and in North Africa only 3 years ago, when the Egyptian working class in marvelous spontaneous movements tried to break not just with Mubarak, but with the system that developed Mubarak. In Tunisia, which is the only Arab country today, which you say is not under the dictatorship, but is not under the pressure of a military regime. I'd also say, if you just look at the Middle East and those setbacks the working class have faced, it's a one-sided picture. Because, of course, we've seen the uprising in Scotland, which was a working class uprising, which I will explain a little bit about that later. We've seen the movement towards a general strike in Belgium. We see the way the class struggle is heating up. We see demonstrations. We see which is not unimportant, the election of our comrades in Ireland. We now have 3 MPs. It's like waiting for a London bus. You wait for one, and then 3 come along all at once. It's an indication of the objective situation that is developing. And last but not least, there are the mass strikes that have taken place in Britain, uniquely in a way. They're not being carried through, but you have not seen, before the general election, the trade union leadership pushed into fainting in the direction of action like we've seen in Britain in the last couple of weeks itself. And then there is, of course, as I've mentioned, the victory of the uprising that took place in Scotland. That was under the revolt, if you like, a national revolt, but that was a proletarian uprising. It was the major forces of the working class in the west of Scotland and also in the east, in Dundee and Glasgow, that was responsible for those developments that took place. Now, I believe that these election results are not a flash in the pan. We've also had the victory in Seattle. I visited Seattle on 2 occasions in the last 3 months. That's a little payment on account. It doesn't mean to say that our success or history will move in a straight line. There will be victories, there will be pauses, and there will be setbacks. We've had many victories of this character in relation to the history of our organisation itself. We had, for instance, the victory of Joe Higgins on the first water charges battle. And then he was defeated. He was elected, by the way, during the greatest boom in Irish history, during the so-called Celtic Tiger. He was defeated when the bottom fell out of the Irish economy and fell out, if you like, of the bottom of capitalism itself. There are many factors that make for radicalisation, that make for opportunities for the revolutionary wing to make a breakthrough. And of course, we've had in the last couple of days the election campaign of Jess Spear that got about 16% of the vote. Some people might be weeping in their beer. But against the background of this situation in America, that's a payment on account. That's an anticipation of the way that the situation is likely to develop. Because only when you get a change in the objective situation, which includes the living standards of the working class, and that's the main reason why we've had the success of Sharma and why we've had this very important vote for Jess Spear. Because capitalism, you all understand this, is in an economic crisis in which it's very difficult to see a way out for capitalism that will repeat the situation prior to the crisis of 2008. The Eurozone is mired in what one commentator for the Financial Times called a depression. He didn't mince words. We have a disappointing growth in Germany, which was the powerhouse of Western Europe. Japan, the third largest economy, is on the edge of a downturn at the present time. And the general position in world capitalism is indicated by a drop in the price of oil by 20%. This is partly because of the so-called shale revolution and the cheap oil that's being produced as an overhead of that, as a product of that, in relation to the developments and the explorations in the US. But when you get a situation like this, which will impact on the whole of the world, it's already impacted on Russia and affected the national budget of Russia. China, which imports most of its fuel from abroad and most of the energy from abroad, will face increasing slowdown in the next period. And if you look a little bit further into the future, Saudi Arabia, which has been one of the strong points of world capitalism, reactionary in its social situation and the role it plays in the Middle East, nevertheless, Saudi Arabia has got the seeds of colossal upheavals if you take this development together, of course, with other developments in relation to the Middle East itself. The IMF has cut global growth rate to little over 3%. And Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, who usually speaks about the great future that is opening up for capitalism and the peoples of the world, talks now about the mediocre in the world economy for the long term. Stanley Fischer, Vice Chair of the US Federal Reserve, makes similar warnings when he says, and people should register this statement, that there's going to be a permanent downshift in the economic prospects for growth of all the major advanced industrial countries. Now, we often repeat at meetings like this that there's no such a thing as the final crisis of capitalism. If the working class does not take power, the capitalists can always find a way out on unstable equilibrium on the bones of the working class. So that's a little bit, going a little bit too far, if you like, on the part of Fischer himself. But what it means is there's an entirely different backdrop now in the world economy to the situation that has existed in the past. Inequality, as we all know, is now the major concern in most of the national press and commentators. And this is not just a reflection of the growth between the classes and what that will mean in terms of the class struggle. Commentators, that's bourgeois economic commentators, have mentioned that it can have, under certain circumstances, an economic effect in provoking a contraction in the economy or perpetuating a crisis for longer than it otherwise will have been. And that's the case undoubtedly in the US. Because believe it or not, the US is one of the few countries in the world that's experiencing a boom. Britain is held up as a paragon for economic developments by most of the serious press. And yet the average worker in Britain, the average person, has no real feeling that this is a boom. Because we know this is a joyless boom or a joyless recovery where wages are stagnant, where living standards have dropped and a very thin layer of the population has managed to get by in this situation. And this is despite the fact that they've injected, if you like, an enormous amount of liquidity through QE, quantitative easing, which they've just withdrawn gingerly in the US, and that provoked a drop in the stock exchanges internationally. So what we have now is in a so-called boom where world capitalism is allegedly going ahead, and it appears to. We have the soothsayers of capitalism warning, in effect, about another crisis, warning about the possibility of the bottom dropping out of the world economy. Many of them are speculating. In fact, the Bank of England is conducting exercises about the difficulties of world capitalism, and they call it Wargames. That's their feeling about the consequences, if you like, of the next crisis. And if the crisis is postponed and put off, and they have the possibility of doing that, that will just stoke up the contradictions of the system itself. It will be worse than 2008, or at least that is the possibility, that it could be worse than 2008, and any boom or any continuation of the present situation will be fueled by debt, and that will only pile up the contradictions that will break at a later stage. That's why one section of the capitalist class, even though it means increasing the debt, are actually speculating that it would be better for the capitalists to boost expenditure, to, if you like, feed the flames, rather than to face this situation at the present time. We have a paradoxical situation that, for instance, the German Bundesbank is urging the cowardly trade union leaders in Germany to go on strike. When have you, for a 3% wage increase? When have you ever seen a banker on a picket line? But metaphorically, they are advocating a picket line and strikes because capitalism is in this dilemma, because of the incomes of the working class, which have been shrunk. And that's a world phenomenon. It's not just in Britain. In fact, in Britain, you have to say, this is the worst period for wages and the living standards of the working class, not my words, but the words of the Financial Times of a couple of days ago, since the long depression of the late 19th century itself. Others, of course, we don't need to name names, but George Osborne, Cameron, and this government are advocating screwing down the living standards of the working class in another vicious austerity. All of this is an indication, in my opinion, of the stoking up economically of an even worse position that we have today that will result in a reaction from the working class. We can't predict this kind of in a arithmetical form, because the working class to some extent is still a little bit stunned by the crisis itself, lacks confidence, because the leaders of the trade union movement have not conducted a real struggle. And therefore, the situation today is indicated by those developments that I mentioned, but I left one out, and that is the movement in Hong Kong. And by the way, when we're talking about Trotskyism, it's not a mistake that the only Trotskyist force that has a base on the periphery of China and in China is the CWI. And our comrades have played a marvellous role in the movements that have taken place in Hong Kong. It's mostly confined to the students, but nevertheless the students in Chinese history have played a crucial role as a barometer and a stimulator of the masses in the course of struggle. They played that in 1919 in the demonstrations against the Versailles Treaty. Only 11 of them came together and organised a mass movement, and that 11, by the way, became the founders of what was the Chinese Communist Party, which in turn led to a mass organisation and the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 1927. Look at the reaction of Beijing to these movements in Hong Kong. A little demonstration took place in Beijing. First of all, they've condemned the movements in Hong Kong, and by the way, the Chinese army has forces in Hong Kong and can intervene at any time. But a little demonstration of young people took place on Halloween, trick or treat. It was automatically banned by the Chinese regime, because even a social gathering in these charged situations can lead to a movement that could threaten the regime itself. If you look at capitalism from a world point of view, it's an incredible situation that is developing at the moment. The dilemma for capitalism is summed up in the cash hoards, which are now stored up in the banks, the big banks, in the big companies, and to some extent in the US Treasury itself. And the phenomenon now exists. The cash hoards have dropped a little bit, and they're as a result of the enormous super profits that are being made by big business. But part of those cash hoards have dropped recently because the CEOs of the big corporation have begun to buy back their shares. For whatever reason, it's a mystery to most of the average person. It doesn't add anything to the value of the company except the share value. But we have the phenomenon now of share value capitalism, and the higher the share, the bigger the income of the CEO. In other words, capitalism through this demonstrates its complete parasitism. It's lost its raison d'etre, which is to develop the productive forces and provide an engine through which society will actually develop itself. I've already mentioned the situation that has developed with Stanley Fischer and the Treasury in the US. It shows why we won in the battle that took place in Seattle with Sharma. And Jeff Spears repeated that, or had a very good showing in the last couple of days. But we've not conducted the struggle in Seattle, or anywhere else for that matter, in isolation. You'll see Sharma at the rally tonight. She's a very good, articulate tribune of working class people, and has had a phenomenal effect, not just in Seattle, but in New York and throughout the US. But that's because it's not in this one town. The whole of the US is prepared by the factors that I've mentioned for an explosion. And that's why Bernie Sanders, a so-called socialist senator, is under ferocious pressure from us and others. The Greens are under pressure to put up candidates in the elections in 2 years' time. They were under pressure this time in the midterm elections. Unfortunately, they're hesitating. We don't see the success of Socialist Alternative as a one-off or as our efforts alone. It's a step towards creating a new focal point for the American working class, a new mass, radical, if possible socialist, but a left party that can act as a pole of attraction. There's similar movements of Howie Hawkins in New York. There are developments in Chicago that I observed some time ago. So we have, if you like, as in Britain, a dual strategy of, on the one side, building our forces, but it's a very difficult electoral system to make a breakthrough just by one or two parties, but of bringing together a coalition of left parties that can challenge the capitalist parties and prepared in that way for a real future for the working class itself. Why did Obama lose in the midterm elections? By the way, that probably disappointed many workers in the USA, that the hated Republicans have got back. The Republicans didn't win on their own merit. They didn't win on the basis of support for their program. It was largely disappointment at the record of Obama. Obama has expelled from the country more immigrants than all other previous presidents put together. It's had a huge effect on the immigrant communities of the US. He's also done nothing about the minimum wage. And you have a position in the US today, let me remind you, and I experienced it when I was there, that 80% of the adult population does not expect their children to have the same living standards as themselves. In other words, America, which was the country of the religion of capitalist progress, that today was better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than that, and the day after tomorrow, and so on. That has been shattered by the pauperization of big sections of the US population itself. All the old problems of the past, including racism and including discrimination against the black and Asian population, people of colour, that is now very prevalent, as we see by the events in Ferguson, where you had a young black man. It's a police force armed to the teeth, it's militarised, it buys its weapons, surplus weapons off the American army to police cities and so on, and has acted as an internal political police force against, if you like, an insurgent youth in the US at the present time. Socialist Alternative intervened there, of all the left groups, and got a very good response with our black and Asian section, and also with white comrades as well. The midterm elections, I've mentioned it before, there's the ground there. It's not a move towards the right. No doubt many of the papers in the next couple of days will comment on that. It's really opposition from the youth. It's abstention in the main that allowed Obama to be defeated and the Republicans to be returned. Now it's possible that the Republicans might think that they can use this victory to create a new foreign policy, a more interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere. They won't be able to do that because the mood in America, after the Iraq War and after the events of the last period, it won't be a repetition of Iraq. In fact, there is an Iraq syndrome in the US today. And that is like the Vietnam syndrome. And that Iraq syndrome is never again will we intervene in the way we did in Iraq with boots on the ground and try and change the course of history with the policy of occupation and so on. They will have to intervene in order to protect US's interests, but that will be more of a kind of military police type intervention. They will also try and extend the power of US imperialism through NAFTA and through the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. That will come up against the opposition of China in Asia and will come up against the other imperialist powers. In other words, we have in the US now and worldwide, we no longer have Pax Americana. At the time of the Iraq War, the neocons said, after the victory in Iraq, we've established a new Rome that will dominate the whole of the world. That is being shattered by the developments in Iraq and by the subsequent developments in the Middle East. In the events that took place 3 years ago, in relation to Egypt, in relation to Tunisia and so on, in the first phase of the war in the Middle East, they could not intervene in that war. They were paralyzed. Obama was paralyzed. I'll come to this in a moment. Before that, I just want to finish, if you like, in relation to our contribution on the economy. that you not only have these factors that I've mentioned, you've also got now the development of technology and robotics. I've got an article in the current issue of Socialism Today in which we explore this situation. And yes, robotics and automation has been mentioned by many people in the past, including by Keynes, who's a bourgeois economist. But this is an entirely different dilemma that is facing capitalism today. Robert Gordon, an economist in the US, says that 47% of current existing jobs in the US will be wiped out. Most of these jobs, by the way, are jobs that are taken by the middle class, white-collar jobs and so on. There will be manufacturing jobs that will be wiped out. Look at the colossal development of technology, especially with 3D computers and so on, which can produce machines out of machines. It represents an entirely different development. And it's not just the working class who are concerned about this. It's sections of the middle class. What I find interesting is somebody like Jeffrey Rifkin, who wrote a book on this and actually comes out with a quasi-socialist alternative. He doesn't say the working class has an alternative. He says capitalism is finished and what will be put in its place will be a commons, a bit like the commons that existed between capitalism and socialism, where people will share. And today, by the way, music is shared freely on the internet. Science is exchanged with one another. They can't commodify. They only get their income, if you like, through gigs. I'm talking about music here, through gigs and through personal appearance. That's the way they get their income. And if the human labour contained in commodities comes down, that could be the death knell of capitalism. This is the thesis that this individual argues about. And I'm telling you, when I was in America and I mentioned this, it was as if electric lights were coming on. Because what does this mean? It means not just the working class can be radicalized. It means the middle class now, through jobs, through the technological developments and the way that this offers a way out, but it can be crushed and stultified by capitalism. Many technological developments existed in the 1930s, but they were never put into place because instead of 3 million in Britain, you would have had double that and more. And what does this mean? It means that the middle layers of society, particularly the youth of the ruling class or the youth of the petty bourgeois, they potentially can be radicalized, maybe on issues like this, and then on the broader issues that we campaign on. And that means the social reserves of capitalism, which have already been eaten away, those social reserves are weakened, and these sections can come over to the side of the working class, either in a friendly approach or actively one to opposition. That adds a new impetus to the work of the Socialist Party and the universities, with the brightest, if you like, sections of the youth. We don't want dilettantes, as some organizations would like, to endlessly discuss, but to move towards a Marxist position, and then on the basis of that Marxist position, being won over to that and turn towards the working class itself. That's a big possibility in the situation that is now opening up. But we're not talking here just about internationally. There's great opportunities that will develop in Europe in the next period. Europe has gone through a phase, if you like, of mild reaction, where there's not been big struggles of the working class. And the main reason for that is the disappointment that workers have felt after 30 general strikes, over 30 general strikes in Greece. There's now an impasse. That's largely because of the leadership of the workers' organizations. There's a similar situation in relation to Spain, Portugal, and so on. And we even have the horrific possibility that Marine Le Pen can beat Hollande in a presidential election when it takes place. In fact, France, the regime in France of Hollande is so discredited, he's on now about 14% of the opinion polls when he won over 50% in the presidential elections. And the reason for that is because he's turned towards a policy of austerity. He's aping Osborne, he's aping the Tories and so on. And that's provided, like with UKIP here, it's provided possibilities for the right wing, for the National Front, to grow in this situation. And it's even possible that Le Pen could beat Hollande, could beat the Socialist Party, could beat what many people would consider to be the candidate of the working class and the left, and that will have colossal repercussions. When in 1933 Hitler took power, the French Nazis came out onto the streets a year later in 1934 with razors, with guns, ready to attack the working class. The French working class rose and drove them off the streets. 2 years later, there was the occupation of the factories when it was possible for the working class to take power. If this happens in France with the traditions of the French workers, that is entirely possible. Then we have the prospect in Greece of a Syriza government coming to power, which is totally inept in solving the problems of the working class. By the way, it's a little health warning. We stand for a new workers' party, but it's not the last word in the struggles of the working class, because Syriza is a new workers' party. But it's gone from demanding nationalisation of the banks and the cancellation of the debt to now saying a partial cancellation of the debt. But it's ahead in the opinion polls, and if it comes to power, we're not saying it would be certain, such are the stoked up opposition in the ranks of the working class in Greece, that could be a signal for a revolutionary storm in Greece, for the occupation of the factories, because you cannot go on repressing and suppressing the working class in this way of constant attacks without a break at a certain stage. And that's without a mass revolutionary party. Such a development can take place. We saw the same thing in Italy, where this creature Renzi has come to power and thinks he can take back from the Italian workers everything that they've established over a long period of time. And that can be also a reaction as well. So that's one side of the general situation, comrades. The other side, of course, and Marxists are optimistic, but we're also sober in our analysis. We cannot pretend that reaction is ruling the roost in the Middle East at the present time. In fact, one letter appearing in the Financial Times said the dream is over. Reaction is dominant in Egypt. It's dominant in all the states in the Middle East, maybe apart from Tunisia. And even in Tunisia, it supplied the majority of the jihadis, the foreign jihadis that are fighting with ISIS at the present time itself. The one thing about Tunisia is the strength of the labour movement that can still have a big effect on the development of events. But why have these developments, these reactionary developments taking place? There's one overriding reason. The major weakness throughout the region is the lack of strong, independent organisations of the working class. That's why Sisi he's been able to take power and establish himself as an Egyptian dictator. He imagines he can repeat what Nasser did, but it's an entirely different period today. Nasser leaned on the former Soviet Union with enormous subsidies from the Soviet Union. It was in a radicalization period, but of course there was no democracy. And the workers' organizations, insofar as they existed, were very small and so on. That's not the position that faces Sisi today. There still are independent, weak organizations of the working class. We have to base ourselves upon that. We disagree with other Marxists who look towards a progressive movement in all kinds of developments which are not working class. Only an independent movement of the working class can establish a sufficient base to take the peoples of this area forward. Only an independent working class in different countries can establish a socialist confederation. And it was interesting, the Financial Times carried an article recently about a federation as being the only way out in Iraq. The caliphate, this idea of ISIS, is a reactionary utopia. You cannot build not only a modern state, you could not build a viable state on this basis, based upon terror, with the methods of the medieval armies of just announcing you'll kill everybody and they will flee. At a certain stage, there will be a movement, an opposition to this. If we're not successful, and I'm talking here about we in the broad sense of the term, of the world labour movement, if we're not successful, then an arc of sectarianism can develop from Pakistan right through the Middle East, and there can be blowback in the advanced industrial countries as well. We've already seen it. It doesn't take the numbers that the Caliphate or ISIS have got. It takes a handful of suicide bombers, where people who go to fight in that, misguided youth, go to fight in that campaign, and the blowback produces an enormous division in the working class. We've seen this in Northern Ireland, and it took Herculean efforts for the working class in Northern Ireland, and our comrades in Northern Ireland played a tremendous role in that. The idea of terrorism was a shortcut. It had no opportunity of beating the British state, never mind succeeding in overthrowing the regimes in the Middle East itself. Imperialism cannot win through an aerial campaign alone. The idea of boots on the ground is ruled out now by US imperialism. Only these independent movements of the working class offer a lifeline for the working class. Without this, you have the horror of something like the 30 Years' War in the Middle Ages. Even Obama has talked about the situation taking years to defeat ISIS. And if you take this against the background of a period now, the most disturbed period of world relations since the end of the Cold War itself, and ironically, it's taking place on the anniversary of the Cold War. There's no dominant power now, as I've said. What we have is an inter-imperialist rivalry. There's not a clash between two social systems, as there was in the Cold War, with Russia and Eastern Europe being what we would call deformed worker states of a planned economy, but with a one-party regime. And on the other hand, you had the capitalist countries opposed to them. These are struggles between different imperialist countries. How disgraceful then that some alleged Marxists took different sides during the campaign in the Ukraine. We were opposed to the oligarchs on one side or another. We were opposed to the fascists on one side and another. And as in other situations, we call for the unity of a working class. Look at the horror now in Libya, and how disgraceful it was of only a few years ago that some alleged Marxists supported the intervention of British and American imperialism to play a police role in Libya. The consequences of that is not just in the breakup of Libya now, of warlords ruling the roost, but is also a blowback, if you like, in that little town where these out-of-control Libyan forces trained are running riot, are causing mayhem at the present time. If you like, we've entered a period when, alongside of one another, there will be elements of revolution and elements of counter-revolution as well. The poll in Scotland shows one side, the strikes in Britain, and so on. But at the same time, it won't develop in a straight line. There will be opportunities for us, for the Trotskyists, for the left, to intervene in the movements that will take place. So I would say there's a bright future for genuine Trotskyism in the 21st century. And I emphasize genuine Trotskyism, and no doubt I can see people in the audience who raise the idea, the role of Trotsky, and even the role of Trotskyists, and we will welcome and we will participate in that debate. But Trotskyism is modern Marxism. That's what it means. Marxism still remains the best tools for analysing the world situation and of formulating a programme that can arm the working class in this movement. But there are counterfeit varieties of Trotskyism. Many who are able to repeat the phrases of Trotsky, but don't have a clue about his methods and how to relate this to the real movement of the working class. We have under our belt, as a badge of honour, the struggles in Liverpool, which no other Trotskyist organisation can equal in its effects, not just on interested layers of the middle class or students, and we welcome them, but touching the working class. No other force in Britain or on a European scale has been able to achieve what we've achieved. No other force was able to lead an army like us with the poll tax army that defeated Thatcher. I mentioned that at the rally tonight. And we have other examples of the comrades in Ireland in the water charges tax, defeated that, and in the process Joe Higgins was elected and the other comrades that followed him. These are great achievements for, if you like, genuine Trotskyism. But it will be as nothing compared to the opportunities that will be posed in the next period itself. And for Trotskyism to succeed, it needs all the things I've said, of a clear program, a clear perspective, but also in addition to that, that when you make a mistake, and we have made a few mistakes, you correct that mistake openly, so you educate your own members. It's only in that way will you be able to build an organisation that is prepared to go to the end. And moreover, if you don't correct mistakes, you will repeat them again and again. For instance, support for Hugo Chavez slavish support in an opportunistic manner, which was totally wrong in the situation that existed then. And the organisation that supported that didn't gain anything except a reputation for opportunism. This will be a period when all parties, all tendencies, all groups will be challenged by the situation. And in my opinion, most of them will be found wanting. That doesn't mean to say we write them all off. We will discuss, as we are discussing, with different organisations throughout the world. Even where we don't agree, we are prepared to form a bloc, a united front, if you like, with those organisations that genuinely represent an approach towards the workers' organisations and are prepared to work in a loyal and a comradely fashion. I'm confident that the best layers of the working class have moved into action, but the best layers of the working class, if you like, have not yet begun to move into action. Some of the best recruits for us will come in the future, and it will be on the basis of events and study and discussion like this that we can build a force that here in Britain can build a powerful focal point for the working class in Britain through the CWI, can act as a pole of attraction and come together with other like-minded forces to create the basis of, if you like, a stronger world force that could lay the base for a mass international. Once we do that, and once we have strong parties of the working class, and here we're just dealing with Trotskyism and its role in this process, we build mass parties, and I think we can do that, then you have the opportunity of having a lever that can change the world. I think that will be posed in the next period. I think you should all participate in this great endeavour, and I hope in that way we can have a fruitful discussion here this afternoon. We can strengthen our forces. We can strengthen, of course, the Socialist Party. Those of you who are not a member, I hope you'll travel into our ranks, and in that way we'll strengthen the socialist future of the working class. Thank you.